You know, there are moments in life, rare moments, when something happens that doesn't just shift your personal trajectory, it disturbs the entire structure of competence hierarchies around you. And most people never even get close to that. They play it safe. They negotiate with their own potential. They whisper instead of speaking. They hesitate instead of acting. But every so often, someone does something so precise, so unexpected, so undeniably effective, that even the people at the very top, the ones who are used to predicting everything, go silent. And that silence, it's not confusion. It's recognition. Because when a system is stable, when an industry is comfortable, when everyone is operating within known parameters, there's a kind of predictable rhythm to success and failure. The winners win in expected ways. The losers lose in familiar patterns. But then someone steps in, maybe underestimated, maybe ignored, and they don't follow the script. They don't ask for permission. They don't even announce themselves properly. They just act. And the action is so aligned, so sharp, that it cuts through all the noise at once. That's the moment where things get interesting. Because competence recognizes competence. And when something genuinely new emerges, something that actually works, it forces everyone watching to confront a very uncomfortable reality. That the game they thought they understood isn't as closed as they believed. And that's destabilizing. Not just practically, but psychologically. It shakes people. It forces a recalibration of what's possible. Now think about that for a second. What would you have to do? How far would you have to push yourself? How disciplined would you have to become? How much nonsense would you have to strip away to produce something so undeniable that even the most powerful observers couldn't immediately respond? Not because they don't have opinions, but because what just happened doesn't fit into their existing framework. That's not luck. That's the byproduct of relentless alignment between what you're capable of and what you're actually doing. It's what happens when you stop fragmenting yourself, when your attention, your effort, your intent all point in the same direction. And most people never experience that because it's brutally difficult. It requires sacrifice. It requires that you let go of weak strategies, shallow validation, and the comfort of staying unnoticed. But if you do it, if you really do it, there comes a point where the result speaks so loudly that explanation becomes irrelevant. And in that moment, the reaction you get isn't applause, it's silence. Most people never truly disrupt anything of consequence. And it isn't because they lack intelligence or even opportunity. It's because they enter into a quiet, almost invisible negotiation with their own potential. And that negotiation happens daily, in small, seemingly insignificant decisions. You decide not to push a little harder when you could. You decide to delay what you know is necessary. You convince yourself that maintaining comfort is somehow a reasonable trade for the possibility of something greater. And over time, those decisions accumulate, not into failure exactly, but into something perhaps worse, predictability. Because the truth is, potential is a destabilizing force. If you actually aimed at it seriously, it would demand that you change. It would demand that you reorganize your habits, your time, even your identity. And that's not a trivial thing. People underestimate how threatening that is psychologically. It's not just about working harder. It's about confronting the gap between who you are and who you could be, and that gap is often far larger than people are comfortable admitting. So instead of confronting it directly, people bargain with it. They say, "I'll try, but only to a certain extent," or "I'll improve, but not at the cost of my current stability," or even more subtly, "I'll wait until the conditions are perfect." And those conditions, of course, never arrive. Because perfection is a moving target, And using it as a prerequisite is one of the most effective ways to ensure you never fully commit. What's particularly insidious about this is that it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels rational. It feels responsible, even. You tell yourself you're being strategic, that you're managing risk, that you're thinking things through. But underneath all of that is a refusal to expose yourself to the kind of pressure that would actually reveal what you're capable of. And without that pressure, nothing transformative happens, because disruption, real disruption, is not the result of half measures. It doesn't emerge from people who are cautiously testing the waters while keeping one foot safely on shore. It comes from individuals who have, for one reason or another, decided that the cost of not pursuing their potential is higher than the cost of pursuing it. And that's a profound shift in perspective. Once that shift occurs, the negotiation stops. You're no longer asking yourself whether you feel like doing something. You're no longer justifying delay with elaborate reasoning. Instead, you orient yourself toward what is necessary, and you act accordingly. And that action, when sustained over time, begins to differentiate you in ways that are difficult to ignore. Because most people are still negotiating. They're still holding back just enough to remain comfortable, just enough to avoid real risk, just enough to ensure that if things don't work out, they can say they never fully committed anyway. It's a form of self-protection, but it comes at a cost. The cost is that you never generate enough force to actually move anything significant. And so the world remains unchanged around them. Not because change is impossible, but because they never fully step into the position required to produce it. True impact is a rare phenomenon, and it's rare for a reason. It doesn't emerge from vague intention or scattered effort. It arises when your actions become so precise, so aligned with reality, that they cut through complexity instead of adding to it. And that level of precision is not accidental. It's cultivated. It's the result of paying attention, serious, sustained attention, to what works and what doesn't, and having the discipline to adjust accordingly. Most people operate in a fog of approximation. They try things but not carefully. They aim but not accurately. They put in effort, but it's fragmented, inconsistent, diluted by distraction and second-guessing. And because of that, their results are equally inconsistent. Nothing they do lands with enough force to create a noticeable shift. It's movement, but it's not direction. Precision changes that. When you begin to refine what you're doing. When you stop tolerating sloppiness in your thinking and your behavior. You start to close the gap between intention and outcome. You notice where your assumptions are wrong. You correct your errors not defensively, but voluntarily. You begin to understand the structure of the domain you're operating in, whether that's business, creativity, or personal development. And that understanding allows you to act in ways that are not just active, but effective. And effectiveness is what differentiates noise from impact, because the world is full of noise. Endless activity, endless opinions, endless attempts that never quite reach their target. But when something is genuinely effective, it stands out immediately. Not because it's loud, but because it works. It produces a result that cannot be easily dismissed or ignored. That's where expectations begin to break. Because most systems, industries, institutions, even social circles are built on patterns. People learn what typically happens, who typically succeeds, what strategies usually work. And over time, those patterns become assumptions. They form an invisible framework that guides how people interpret new information. So when you act within that framework, even if you're competent, you're still predictable. But precision has the potential to disrupt that. If what you do is accurate enough, if it addresses a problem in a way that others have overlooked or underestimated. It doesn't just fit into the existing pattern. It exposes the limitations of that pattern. It reveals that something important was missing or misunderstood. And that realization is unsettling, especially for those who believe they had already mapped the territory. It forces a reassessment. And reassessment is not comfortable. It requires that people admit, at least implicitly, that their previous understanding was incomplete. That's why genuinely effective actions often meet resistance at first. Not because they're wrong, but because they challenge the stability of what's already established. But if the action is precise enough, if the result is undeniable, resistance doesn't last. Because reality has a way of asserting itself. You can argue with an idea, you can dismiss a claim, but it's much harder to argue with something that demonstrably works. And when that happens, when your action produces a result that aligns so tightly with reality that it cannot be ignored, it creates a kind of rupture, a break between what people expected and what actually occurred. And in that break, something new becomes possible when you stop seeking permission and start executing. Something fundamental shifts in the way you relate to the world. Because seeking permission, whether you realize it or not, is often a way of outsourcing responsibility. You look to others, to institutions, to some external authority to validate your direction before you fully commit to it. And on the surface, that seems reasonable. It seems cautious, even wise. But beneath that, there's a deeper issue, which is that you're allowing your capacity for action to be constrained by systems that are, by their very nature, slower and more conservative than you need them to be. Execution, on the other hand, is immediate. It places the burden and the opportunity directly on you. Most people underestimate how much time they lose waiting. Waiting for approval, waiting for the right moment, waiting until they feel confident enough to proceed. But confidence is not something that precedes action in any reliable way. It's something that emerges from it. And if you're always positioning yourself as someone who needs to be reassured before acting, you never accumulate the evidence required to actually trust yourself. So you remain dependent, and dependency makes you predictable. Because if your actions are filtered through external validation, then they're constrained by whatever rules, expectations, or limitations those external sources impose. You move when you're told it's acceptable to move. You adjust when it's deemed appropriate. And over time, your behavior starts to follow a pattern that can be easily anticipated. But when you begin to execute, without that constant need for permission, that pattern breaks. You start making decisions based on your own analysis, your own observations, your own willingness to take responsibility for the outcome. And that doesn't mean you act recklessly. In fact, it's the opposite. It means you become more attentive, more engaged, because you can no longer defer the consequences to someone else. Every action you take is yours fully, and that changes the stakes. Because now, instead of waiting for a green light, you're generating momentum. You're testing ideas in real time. You're learning through direct interaction with reality rather than through second-hand approval. And that kind of learning is faster, sharper, and far more adaptive. It allows you to adjust quickly, to refine your approach based on what actually happens, not what you think might happen. That's where unpredictability begins to emerge, because systems, especially large ones, rely heavily on patterns. They anticipate behavior based on historical data, on what people have done before under similar circumstances. But when you're no longer operating within those expected constraints, when you're not waiting, not hesitating, not aligning yourself with established timelines, you become difficult to model. And what can't be modeled can't be easily controlled. That's a powerful position to be in, but it's also a demanding one, because it requires that you tolerate uncertainty. You don't have the reassurance of approval to fall back on. You don't have a predefined path that guarantees a certain outcome. What you have instead is responsibility and the necessity to act despite incomplete information. And that's precisely what most people avoid. They prefer the safety of structure, even if that structure limits them, because it reduces the psychological burden of decision-making. But in doing so, they also limit their capacity to produce anything that falls outside the expected range. Execution without permission removes that limitation. It places you in direct contact with possibility, but it also exposes you to risk. And that combination, possibility and risk, is exactly what generates outcomes that others don't see coming. Real competence is a strange thing, because it doesn't behave the way people expect it to. It isn't loud in the way arrogance is loud. It doesn't demand attention in the way insecurity does. In fact, it often goes unnoticed, at least initially, because it isn't concerned with broadcasting itself. It's concerned with functioning properly, with producing results that are grounded in reality rather than inflated by perception. And that's a difficult distinction for people to grasp, especially in an environment where visibility is often mistaken for value. You see it everywhere. People talking more than they're doing, presenting an image of capability that hasn't yet been tested under pressure. And that can work for a while. You can generate attention. You can create the illusion of progress. You can even convince others, and yourself, that you're further along than you actually are. But the problem with that approach is that it's inherently unstable because it's not anchored in something real. Competence is anchored. It's built through repeated interaction with difficulty, through trial and error, through failure that isn't ignored but analyzed. It's the result of adjusting your behavior until it aligns with what actually produces the desired outcome. And that process is not glamorous. It's slow, often frustrating, and it requires a level of honesty that most people are reluctant to engage with. Because to become competent, you have to confront your own inadequacy directly. You have to admit that what you're doing isn't good enough, not in a vague, self-critical way, but in a precise, actionable sense. You have to identify where you're falling short, and then you have to do something about it. And that's uncomfortable. It strips away the protective layer of ego that allows you to feel capable without actually being capable. So people avoid it. They substitute appearance for substance. They focus on how things look rather than how they function. And in doing so, they create a gap between perception and reality that eventually becomes impossible to sustain. Because reality, unlike perception, doesn't bend to preference. It responds to what works. And competence works. It doesn't need to announce itself because its effects are visible. When someone is truly competent, the outcome of their actions carries a kind of weight that's difficult to ignore. Things improve. Problems get solved. Complex situations become more manageable. And that happens consistently, not as a one-time occurrence, but as a pattern. That's when recognition begins to emerge. Not because the individual is demanding it, but because the results are accumulating in a way that draws attention. People start to notice that something is different. That this person, or this approach, is producing outcomes that don't align with the usual level of performance. And that discrepancy creates curiosity, sometimes even discomfort, because it challenges assumptions. It forces others to reconsider what they thought was sufficient, what they believed was effective. And that can be unsettling, especially for those who have invested heavily in maintaining a certain image without the underlying substance to support it. But competence doesn't engage in that game. It doesn't compete on the level of appearance. It operates on a deeper level, where the only metric that matters is whether something works. And when it does, when the results are clear and repeatable, it becomes increasingly difficult for anyone to dismiss it. At that point, recognition is no longer optional.